A simple act of kindness should be a beautiful thing. For 23-year-old waitress Clara Maeve, it began with a shared drawing on a napkin with a silent, lonely boy. This small gesture accomplished what no high-paid specialist could. She gave 6-year-old Leo his voice back. But in the cold, suspicious world of his millionaire father, her miracle was not celebrated. It was seen as a threat, a manipulation. Instead of gratitude, she was met with a devastating accusation. A reaction so cruel it didn't just break her heart. It left her standing alone, utterly shattered. The bell above the door of the Daily Grind diner was a constant, cheerful jingle in Clara Maeve's life. It was the soundtrack to her days, a rhythm punctuated by the clatter of ceramic plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the low hum of conversations. For Clara, a third-year speech pathology student at Northwood University, the diner wasn't just a job. It was a living laboratory of human connection. She saw first dates, business deals, lonely seniors nursing a single cup of coffee for hours, and families celebrating small victories. And then there were the Sterlings. They weren't like her other regulars. They arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at precisely 4:15 p.m., as if governed by a silent internal clock. The man, Dorian Sterling, was a figure carved from granite and ambition. His suits were so perfectly tailored they seemed to repel the diner's greasy spoon charm. His jaw was perpetually tight, his eyes a shade of Arctic blue that rarely seemed to focus on anything inside the diner for more than a fleeting second. He was handsome in a severe, unapproachable way, a man who commanded boardrooms and probably stock markets with the same terse efficiency he used to order. Black coffee. The boy will have a chocolate milkshake and fries, he'd say, not looking at her, his attention already on the sleek, impossibly thin tablet he'd place on the table. The boy was Leo. At 6 years old, Leo Sterling was a miniature version of his father with the same dark hair and piercing blue eyes. But where Dorian's gaze was sharp and dismissive, Leo's was worn and searching, absorbing the world with a profound, unnerving silence. He never spoke, not a word, not a please or a thank you. He didn't whisper or stammer or point. He simply existed in a bubble of quiet, his small hands usually folded in his lap, his eyes following the movements of the other patrons with a deep, inscrutable longing. For the first few months, Clara treated them like any other customer. She'd bring their order, offer a warm smile that was never returned by the father, and give a little extra smile to the boy, who would sometimes let his eyes linger on hers for a half-second before flitting away. But Clara, with her student's mind, trained to see the mechanics of communication, saw more than just a quiet child. She saw the tension in his small shoulders, the way he would flinch if a plate clattered too loudly, the subtle way his breathing would quicken when his father took a sharp, impatient tone on a phone call. This wasn't shyness. This was a fortress. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the diner was unusually quiet. The Sterlings sat in their usual booth by the window, the rain streaking down the glass like tears. Dorian was particularly engrossed in his tablet, his brow furrowed. Leo, having finished his fries, was listlessly pushing salt grains around with his finger. Clara was refilling the sugar shakers when she saw it. A group of children from a birthday party at another table were laughing, their loud, joyous shrieks filling the air. Leo's head snapped up. His eyes fixed on them were filled with a raw, painful yearning that struck Clara to her core. It wasn't the look of a child who wouldn't speak. It was the look of a child who couldn't. Driven by an impulse she couldn't explain. Clara grabbed a fresh napkin and a pen from her apron. On her way to refill Dorian's coffee, she paused. She didn't look at the father. Her focus was entirely on the small boy. She leaned down slightly, placing the napkin and pen on the table in front of him. "Hi, Leo," she whispered, her voice soft as the falling rain. "My name is Clara. I really like your red sweater." Dorian Sterling's head shot up from his tablet, his eyes flashing with annoyance at the interruption. A cold glare meant to dismiss her instantly settled on her, but Clara held her ground, her gaze fixed on Leo. Leo stared at the napkin, then at the pen. His hand, small and pale, hovered over it for a long moment. He glanced at his father, a flicker of fear in his eyes, then back at Clara. Her smile was gentle, expecting nothing. Slowly, hesitantly, he picked up the pen. His grip was awkward, but determined. He didn't write a word. Instead, he drew a small, wobbly circle. Inside the circle, he drew 2 dots for eyes and a straight, flat line for a mouth, a face with no expression. He then drew a series of vertical lines falling from the eyes like rain or tears. He pushed the napkin an inch toward her. Clara's heart ached. She looked at the drawing, then back at Leo's wide, searching eyes. She understood. This was his voice. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that seemed to momentarily warm the chilly booth. "It's a very good drawing," she said softly. "Thank you for showing me." Dorian Sterling watched the entire exchange, his expression unreadable but tight. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to reprimand her for bothering them. But he stopped. For the first time, he saw not just a waitress, but a person who had reached his unreachable son in a way no one else had. He said nothing. He simply watched as Clara walked away, leaving the pen and the heart-breaking little drawing on the table between father and son. That day, the silent ritual was broken. A new one had just begun. The napkin drawing became their secret language. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Clara would bring Leo a clean napkin and a pen along with his milkshake. Dorian Sterling would watch his cold vigilance, a constant presence, but he never intervened. It was as if he'd declared a ceasefire, a grudging allowance for this strange, silent communication he did not understand. Leo's drawings started simple. A house with no door, a tree with no leaves, a sun hiding behind a thick cloud. Clara, drawing on everything she was learning in her classes about non-verbal communication and child psychology, would respond in kind. When Leo drew the leafless tree, she took a green crayon from a box she now kept in her apron and drew tiny budding leaves on the branches. When he drew the sun behind the cloud, she drew a small bird flying towards it undeterred. She never pressured him. She never asked, "What's this, Leo?" or "Why did you draw that?" She simply accepted his offering and added something hopeful to it. Her responses were a quiet promise, "I hear you. You are not alone." One afternoon, Leo drew a boat on a tumultuous, wavy sea. It was a tiny, fragile-looking vessel tossed about by angry, jagged lines. Inside the boat, he drew one small stick figure. Clara's heart clenched. She recognized the profound loneliness in the image. That evening after her shift, she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by textbooks on selective mutism and childhood trauma. The condition was often triggered by a traumatic event, a deep-seated anxiety that literally stole the voice. What she wondered had happened to this sad, silent boy. The next time they came in, she was prepared. When Leo slid the drawing of the lonely boat across the table, she pulled a folded napkin from her apron. She opened it carefully. It was a paper bird she had folded the night before. It was simple, but its wings were wide and strong. She gently placed the paper bird on the table next to his drawing. Leo stared at it. He reached out a hesitant finger and touched the bird's wing. He looked up at her, and for the first time, Clara saw something other than sadness in his eyes. It was curiosity, a flicker of light in the quiet dark. He picked up the bird, turning it over and over in his small hands. He then took his pen, and on his drawing, next to the small stick figure in the boat, he drew a crude representation of the paper bird perched on the figure's shoulder. A companion. A lump formed in Clara's throat. This was more than a breakthrough. It was a conversation. Their silent friendship blossomed. Leo began to anticipate her arrival. His eyes would track her as she moved through the diner. He started bringing things to show her: a shiny rock, a peculiar leaf, a small silver tall car. He would roll back and forth on the table. Each item was an offering a word he could not speak. Dorian Sterling remained an enigma. He observed every interaction with an unnerving intensity. Clara could feel his gaze on her, analytical and suspicious. One day, as she was clearing their table, he spoke to her directly for the first time about something other than the order. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "It's Clara, sir. Clara Maeve." "And what is it you're doing with my son?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it was sharp, demanding. Clara met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm being his friend," she said simply. "It seems like he might need one." Dorian's expression didn't change, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "He has specialists, the best in the country. They haven't been able to befriend him into speaking." "Maybe he doesn't need a specialist right now," Clara replied, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe he just needs a napkin and a paper bird." She expected a rebuke, a dismissal. Instead, Dorian Sterling fell silent, looking down at the small paper bird Leo had left on the table. He seemed to study it for a long moment before placing a $50 bill on the table, far more than the cost of their order, and steering Leo out of the diner without another word. The following week, something shifted. Dorian arrived with Leo, but instead of his usual tablet, he carried a small leather-bound sketchbook and a set of colored pencils. He placed them on the table in front of Leo. "The napkins are getting crowded," he said to Clara. His tone clipped, but the gesture spoke volumes. Leo's eyes lit up. He opened the sketchbook to a fresh page and began to draw. That day he drew the diner. He drew the counter, the milkshake machine, and the other customers. And in the middle of the page, he drew a stick figure with a brown ponytail and a big smile holding a tray. He looked at Clara and pointed to the drawing, then pointed at her. He then took a yellow pencil and drew a bright, shining sun above her head. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. In Leo's silent world, she was the sun. She had to swallow hard before she could speak. "It's beautiful, Leo. It's the best picture you've ever made." From across the table, Dorian Sterling watched his face, a mask of stone. But Clara thought she saw, just for a moment, a crack in the icy facade. A flicker of something that looked devastatingly like hope. He was beginning to see that the millions he spent on top-tier therapists hadn't achieved what a kind-hearted waitress with a box of crayons had she had given his son a language. The sketchbook became Leo's world. It traveled everywhere with him, its pages filling with vibrant, increasingly complex scenes. He drew the park with detailed squirrels and dogs. He drew his room filled with toys no one played with. He drew his father, a tall, imposing figure, often depicted from behind, walking away. The drawings were a diary of his silent heart, and Clara was its sole reader. Their bond deepened, transcending the simple exchanges in the diner. Clara started bringing him small things, a book about constellations, a perfectly shaped seashell, a prism that cast rainbows on the tabletop. Each gift was a new topic of conversation for their silent language. Leo would respond with pages of drawings, starry nights, deep oceans, and rooms filled with dancing light. Dorian Sterling started talking to her, more the questions becoming less suspicious and more curious. "What are you studying?" he asked one afternoon, watching as Clara showed Leo how the prism worked. "Speech-language pathology," she answered. "I'm in my final year." This clearly piqued his interest. "So this is a professional curiosity for you." Clara looked up from the rainbow dancing on Leo's hand and met Dorian's gaze. There was a hint of the old accusation in his tone, the suggestion that this was all just an experiment for her. "It started as a human curiosity," she corrected him gently. "I saw a sad little boy, and I wanted to see him smile. The rest, well, my studies help me understand. But they don't drive my actions." Her sincerity seemed to disarm him. He nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression replacing the guarded one. "His mother, she passed away 2 years ago. An accident. He hasn't spoken a word since the day of the funeral." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. It was the first piece of his personal life he had ever offered, and Clara understood the weight of it. It explained everything: the doorless houses, the leafless trees, the profound sadness in Leo's eyes. It explained the fortress of sense he had built around himself. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. Dorian just gave a curt nod, his emotional armor sliding back into place as quickly as it had fallen. But the confession had changed the dynamic. She was no longer just the waitress. She was now a keeper of their tragedy. The breakthrough, when it came, was not in the quiet, safe space of the diner. It was loud, chaotic, and terrifying. One Thursday, the Sterlings were leaving. Clara was waving goodbye to Leo from the door, a small, familiar ritual they had developed. Leo, holding his father's hand, turned to wave back, a rare, small smile on his face. In his other hand, he clutched his favorite toy, the small silver Aston Martin, a miniature of his father's car. As he turned, his grip loosened. The toy car slipped from his fingers, tumbling off the curb and into the street with a metallic clatter. Time seemed to slow down. Leo's eyes widened in horror. A large delivery truck was turning the corner, its massive wheels just yards away from the tiny, glinting toy. It was more than a toy. It was a totem, a link to his father, a piece of his ordered world. Dorian, distracted for a second, as he unlocked his car, didn't see it happen. But Clara did. Leo stared, frozen. His mouth opened, a silent scream forming. His body tensed, his hands clenched into fists. The truck was getting closer. The toy was about to be crushed. All the pain, all the fear, all the frustration that had been locked inside him for 2 years erupted in a single, desperate, explosive sound. "No!" The word was a strangled sob, a raw, rusty cry torn from his throat. It was loud and clear and full of panic. He lunged forward, trying to run into the street. Dorian spun around, his face pale with shock, and grabbed Leo's arm, pulling him back just as the truck rumbled past its tires, missing the toy car by a mere inch. The street fell silent again, save for the hum of traffic. Dorian was frozen, staring down at his son, his hand still clamped on his arm. Leo was trembling, tears streaming down his face, his gaze fixed on the small silver car lying unscathed in the road. But Clara was looking at Leo. He had spoken. He had shouted. The wall had been breached. She rushed out of the diner, her apron flapping around her. She knelt in front of Leo, ignoring Dorian completely. "Leo, Leo, you did it," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "You used your voice. You saved your car." Leo looked at her, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of terror and astonishment, as if the sound had come from someone else. He looked at his father, whose face was a storm of disbelief and confusion. Then he looked back at Clara, the one constant, safe presence in his world. He took a shuddering breath, and another word, softer this time, a fragile whisper escaped his lips. "Clara." He said her name. Dorian Sterling stumbled back as if he'd been physically struck. He leaned against his car for support. His eyes locked on the waitress, who was now gently retrieving the toy car and placing it back into his son's trembling hand. He had spent a fortune on the nation's leading therapists, psychologists, and specialists. He had subjected his son to hours of sterile clinical observation, and all of them had failed. Yet this waitress, with her napkins and paper birds and endless patience, had just accomplished the impossible. In that moment, watching her comfort his crying, speaking son on a busy city sidewalk, Dorian Sterling knew his life and Leo's would never be the same. The sound of that one word, Clara, echoed louder than any business deal he had ever closed. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock he thought was rusted shut forever. The days following Leo's outburst were a blur of cautious optimism. He didn't suddenly become a chatterbox. The word no had been a dam breaking, and Clara had been the first trickle of water. Now, a slow, hesitant stream of single words began to follow, but almost exclusively for Clara. Milkshake. Fries. Bird. Sun. Each word was a precious gem offered shyly when they were in their booth at the diner. With his father he remained largely silent, reverting to his drawings and gestures, the familiar safety of his quiet world. Dorian Sterling, however, was a changed man. The icy indifference was gone, replaced by a desperate, hungry focus. He watched Clara with an intensity that was unsettling, as if trying to dissect her magic. A week after the incident with the toy car, he asked her to stay after her shift. The diner was empty, smelling of bleach and old coffee. Clara sat nervously in the booth, wiping her hands on her apron. Dorian sat opposite, not as a customer, but as the powerful CEO he was. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Maeve," he began, his tone formal. "I am prepared to offer you a job. Your responsibilities would be to act as a full-time companion and speech aid for Leo." Clara was stunned into silence. He continued, laying out the terms like a business negotiation. "You would live in our guest house. The salary I am prepared to offer is 5 times what you make here. I will also cover the full tuition for the remainder of your university degree and any postgraduate studies you wish to pursue. You can design Leo's schedule, art museum visits, park outings. Whatever you believe will help him. Your only goal is his well-being and continued progress." It was an incredible offer. It was a lifeline, a dream come true for a struggling student. It meant no more worrying about rent, no more exhausting double shifts. It meant she could focus on her studies and, more importantly, on helping Leo. But a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Leaving the diner, their neutral ground, and entering his world felt like a monumental step. The Sterling world was one of cold marble and silent corridors, not warm coffee and friendly chatter. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Say yes. Dorian said, a flicker of raw desperation in his eyes. Please, nothing else is working. You are the only thing that has worked. Seeing that vulnerability in the unshakable Dorian Sterling was the deciding factor. This wasn't just about money. This was a father pleading for his son. Okay, Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, for Leo. 2 days later, Clara Maeve left the daily grind, for the last time, her apron folded neatly in her bag. A black car, sleek and silent, transported her to the Sterling estate. The gates that swept open to receive her were tall and wrought iron, looking more like the entrance to a fortress than a home. The mansion itself was a modern marvel of glass and stone, breathtakingly beautiful but achingly cold. It was less a home than a museum. She was shown to the guest house, a charming, self-contained cottage on the edge of the manicured property that was larger than her entire apartment building. It was luxurious, but isolating. Her first day was surreal. Leo was thrilled to see her, his eyes shining with a joy that made the whole intimidating experience worthwhile. He took her hand and led her on a silent tour of the massive house, ending in his playroom, a room the size of the diner filled with every toy imaginable, all of them neat and untouched. But almost immediately she met the frost. Her name was Isabel. She was Dorian's sister-in-law, the sister of his late wife, Amelia. She had moved in after the accident to help manage the house and Leo. Isabel was elegant, sharp-featured, and possessed eyes that held a permanent chill. She appraised Clara not as a person, but as an infestation. "So you're the waitress," Isabel said, her voice dripping with condescension, as she found Clara and Leo drawing in the playroom. "Dorian told me his unconventional new hire. It's nice to meet you. I'm Clara," she said, extending a hand that Isabel pointedly ignored. "I oversee everything related to Leo's upbringing." Isabel stated her tone, making it clear she saw Clara as a subordinate. "His tutors, his diet, his schedule. Any plans you have will be run by me first." Clara quickly realized that Isabel had constructed the sterile, overly structured world that was suffocating Leo. The specialists had been her choice. The rigid schedules were her design. She saw Leo's silence not as a symptom of trauma, but as a problem to be clinically managed and solved. Clara, with her gentle, play-based approach, was a direct threat to her authority. The battle lines were drawn silently. Isabel would constantly undermine Clara, questioning her methods in front of Dorian. Is it really wise to let him spend all day just drawing Dr. Albright recommended structured phonic drills? Or, a trip to the public park seems like a security risk, Dorian. The grounds here are more than adequate for fresh air. Clara did her best to ignore the hostility, focusing all her energy on Leo. They built forts in the living room, baked cookies in the cavernous kitchen, much to the housekeeper's horror, and spent hours in the garden giving names to the squirrels. Leo began to blossom. The single words became short phrases. Yellow flower. Clara look. Big dog. Each new phrase was a victory for Clara, but it was a fresh wound for Isabel. She saw Leo's progress not as a miracle, but as a transfer of allegiance. Leo, who had been docile and manageable under her care, was now animated and joyful, his world revolving around the former waitress. One evening, Clara overheard Isabel speaking to Dorian in his study. Her voice was a venomous whisper. "You must see what's happening, Dorian. She's not a therapist. She's a child. She's making him dependent on her. It's unhealthy. And what are her true motivations? A girl from a diner suddenly living in a mansion. You're a wealthy, eligible man. You're grieving. You're vulnerable. Don't be naive. Clara's blood ran cold. Isabel wasn't just jealous of her bond with Leo. She was painting her as a manipulative gold digger, a predator targeting a grieving family. She retreated to her guest house, a gilded cage on the edge of a beautiful but dangerous garden. She had entered this world to give Leo a voice, but she was quickly realizing that in the house of Sterling there were vipers in the shadows, and they were beginning to hiss her name. The atmosphere in the Sterling mansion grew thick with unspoken tension. Clara felt Isabel's eyes on her constantly, a cold, critical gaze that followed her from room to room. Every success with Leo was soured by the woman's palpable resentment. Clara pushed forward, pouring her heart into her work. She began to integrate techniques from her studies in a more formal, yet still gentle way. She created word games, disguised as treasure hunts. She read storybooks aloud, pausing to let Leo fill in a word which he slowly began to do. His vocabulary expanded daily. He started asking questions. Why is sky blue? Where Mama go? That last question, whispered one afternoon, as they looked at a family photo, was a turning point. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother. Clara, holding her breath, answered as honestly and gently as she could. Your mama is in a peaceful place, she said softly, hugging him. But she lives on right here. She tapped his chest, right over his heart. In your memories, it's okay to miss her, and it's okay to be sad. Leo didn't cry. He just nodded, leaning his head against her shoulder. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated trust. Unseen Isabel watched from the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't see a compassionate caregiver comforting a child. She saw an intruder overstepping her bounds, encroaching on sacred family territory. She saw a replacement. Isabel's campaign against Clara escalated from passive-aggressive comments to subtle sabotage. She would misplace the art supplies Clara planned to use. She would schedule a tedious tutoring session with one of the old specialists, precisely when Clara had planned an outing. She began to actively sow seeds of doubt in Dorian's mind, twisting every innocent moment she witnessed. Did you see the way he clings to her, Dorian? He never clung to Amelia like that. It's as if she's encouraging an obsession, she'd say over dinner. Or, I found her notes. She's researching family trauma and paternal emotional detachment. It's all very calculated. She's not just helping Leo. She's analyzing you. It's incredibly presumptuous. Dorian, still emotionally fragile and consumed by a mixture of grief and guilt over his own inability to reach Leo, was fertile ground for Isabel's poison. He wanted to believe in Clara, the results were undeniable, but Isabel's whispers preyed on his deepest insecurities. He was a man accustomed to control and predictability. Clara was an anomaly he couldn't quantify, and her bond with his son was a mystery he couldn't solve, which made him vulnerable. The final venomous strike came one rainy evening. Clara had been working late, helping Leo build a complex castle out of blocks in his playroom. They were laughing as the final tower wobbled and fell. It was a sound of pure, childish joy that had been absent from the house for 2 years. Dorian, passing by the open door, paused, a rare, soft smile touching his lips as he watched them. Isabel chose her moment perfectly. She came to his study later that night, a file folder in her hands and a look of grave concern on her face. Dorian, we need to talk about Clara Maeve, she said, her voice low and serious. I did some digging. I was concerned, so I had my private investigator look into her. Dorian's spine stiffened. Isabel, that was not your place. Wasn't it? My sister's son is in her care. I had to be sure. She opened the folder and laid out a series of documents on his desk. She's not just a struggling student, Dorian. Her father left when she was young. Her mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. They were evicted twice. She has student loans piling up. She comes from nothing. That's hardly a crime, Dorian said, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. Of course not, Isabel said smoothly, but it provides context, motivation. She then pulled out the final document. It was a printout of a page from a university social forum. It was Clara's profile. A friend had asked, "What's the dream job after you graduate, Clara?" Her answer, written months before she'd ever met the Sterlings, was innocent enough. The dream. Working with a high-needs pediatric case, a real challenge. Maybe a private role where I can truly make a difference and, finally be financially secure would be a bonus. Isabel had expertly highlighted the last few words. Finally be financially secure. She's been planning this. Isabel insisted, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. This isn't a happy accident. She saw you a wealthy, grieving father with a high-needs pediatric case. She saw an opportunity. The napkins, the smiles, the friendship, it's a textbook long con. She's playing on your emotions, Dorian. She's targeting our family for a payday. Every piece of evidence was circumstantial, every conclusion a malicious twist of the truth. But presented together in the sterile silence of the study, it painted a damning picture. It fed directly into Dorian's deepest fears, that he was a fool, that his wealth made him a target, that this miracle with his son was nothing but a cruel manipulation. The memory of Clara's sincerity fought against the cold, hard facts on his desk. His grief, his guilt, and his instinct to protect his son from any further harm coalesced into a cold, protective rage. He looked at the papers, then at the door through which he'd heard Leo's laughter just hours before. The laughter now sounded different in his memory, less like joy, more like the sound of a successful trap being sprung. Isabel saw the shift in his eyes and knew she had won. She had poisoned the well. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly, the picture of concern. Dorian stood up, his face set like concrete. "I'm going to end this. Tonight." Clara was in the guest house, sketching out a plan for the next day, a trip to the Science Museum to see the dinosaur exhibit she knew Leo would love. She felt a deep sense of contentment. The chill from Isabel was a small price to pay for the light she now saw in Leo's eyes. He was healing. They were healing. A sharp, commanding knock on the door startled her. She opened it to find Dorian Sterling standing on her doorstep, the porch light casting harsh shadows across his face. He looked nothing like the man who had smiled at his son's laughter just hours ago. His expression was thunderous, his arctic blue eyes narrowed to icy slits. Rain began to fall, a soft patter on the roof that seemed to underscore the tension. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of all warmth. "Of course, come in," Clara said, stepping back, her heart beginning to pound with a sudden, inexplicable dread. He didn't move. He just stood in the doorway, letting the cool, damp air seep into the cozy room. "There's no need. This won't take long." He held out a check. "This is a severance payment. It's for 6 months' salary. It should be more than enough." Clara stared at the piece of paper, utterly bewildered. "Severance, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? Leo is doing so well." "Oh, he is," Dorian sneered, and the sound was so ugly, so full of contempt it made Clara flinch. "You've done your job remarkably well. A truly stunning performance." "Performance?" she whispered, the dread in her chest turning into a cold stone. "Don't play naive with me, Miss Maeve. It's over. I know everything." He took a step forward, his presence filling the doorway, radiating a menacing anger. "I know about your past, your financial desperation. I know that this was never about my son. This was about you. This was your dream job, wasn't it? Find a high-needs case with a wealthy family and secure your future." He was throwing her innocent words from the social media post back in her face, twisting them into something monstrous. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "What? No, that's not. Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" he shot back. "It's all there. The calculated kindness, the convenient breakthroughs, the slow, methodical way you've made my son completely dependent on you. You didn't heal him. You've infected him. You've made yourself the center of his world, so you could get to me. So you could get to this." He shook the check in her face. Every word was a physical blow. He was accusing her of the most vile, manipulative plot, turning her genuine affection for Leo into a grotesque caricature of greed. The very core of her intentions, everything she had done out of pure compassion, was being desecrated. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sharp with disbelief and pain. "That's not true," she choked out her voice, trembling. "I love Leo. You've seen him. You've seen how happy he is." "I've seen a masterful actress at work." Dorian's voice rose to a roar, the sound echoing in the quiet night. "You preyed on a grieving father and a traumatized child. You researched our family's tragedy and tailored your approach to exploit our weaknesses. You are a predator," Ms. Maeve wrapped in a sympathetic smile. He threw the check onto the floor at her feet. It landed with a soft flutter, a final insulting punctuation to his tirade. "I want you packed and gone in the morning. A car will be here at 8 a.m. If you ever try to contact me or my son again, I will use every resource at my disposal to obtain a restraining order and ruin any chance you have of ever working with children again. Am I clear?" Clara couldn't speak. A sob was caught in her throat, a knot of pure, agonizing injustice. She stared at him. This man, she had started to see as a fellow soul in pain, now looking at her with nothing but utter hatred. She saw Isabel's poisonous whispers all over his face. She looked from his cold, accusing eyes down to the check on the floor. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever seen. And it was meant as an insult, a payment for services rendered in a disgusting transaction that had only ever existed in his mind. The sight of it made her feel sick. The tears she had been holding back finally broke free, streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of simple sadness. They were tears of rage, of shock, of a heart that had been utterly and wrongfully shattered. Dorian saw her crying, and his face hardened, even more misinterpreting her anguish as the tears of a charlatan who had been caught. "Save it!" He spat, his voice dripping with disgust. He turned his back on her and walked away, disappearing into the rain and the darkness, leaving Clara standing in the open doorway of her gilded cage. The rain began to fall harder, mixing with her tears as she sank to her knees, her body trembling with violent sobs. He hadn't just fired her. He had taken her kindness, her compassion, her genuine love for his son, and he had branded it as something ugly and unforgivable. He hadn't just broken her heart, he had incinerated her spirit. The 8 a.m. car ride away from the Sterling estate was a journey through a grey, blurry world. Clara sat numbly in the back seat, the luxurious leather feeling cold and alien. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night alternating between fits of heartbroken sobs and a hollow, empty shock. She had left the check on the floor. Taking it would have been an admission of guilt, a validation of his vile accusations. She walked away with nothing but her small suitcase and a gaping wound in her soul. She moved back into her tiny apartment, which now felt suffocating. The textbooks on her shelves seemed to mock her, their clinical descriptions of empathy and therapeutic bonding a cruel joke. She called her manager at the daily grind, her voice hoarse, and begged for her job back. The manager, a kind woman named Martha, agreed without hesitation, sensing the desperation in Clara's voice. Putting the apron back on felt like a surrender. The cheerful jingle of the bell above the door was no longer a comfort. It was a painful reminder of where her journey with Leo had begun. Every time a child laughed, her heart clenched. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 4:15 p.m., she would find herself staring at the door, a foolish, masochistic hope flickering in her chest before being brutally extinguished. Meanwhile, at the Sterling mansion, a new kind of silence descended far more profound and chilling than the one that had existed before. Leo had woken up to find Clara gone. He had searched the guest house, his small face etched with confusion, calling her name. Clara, Clara. Isabel had tried to explain it away. Clara had to leave, darling. She has to go back to her old life. Leo didn't believe her. He looked at his father, his blue eyes searching for an answer, but Dorian couldn't meet his gaze. He just muttered something about a new tutor starting next week. That was the last time Leo spoke. The silence returned with a vengeance. It was not the passive, anxious silence of before. This was an active, angry silence. A protest. He refused to engage with anyone. He wouldn't look at his father. He pushed away the new, highly paid specialist Isabel hired. He wouldn't touch the expensive toys in his playroom. His only form of communication was the sketchbook. But the drawings were no longer of sunny parks and friendly squirrels. Page after page was filled with dark, scribbled storms. He drew the diner empty and grey. He drew his house with bars on the windows. And over again, he drew a stick figure with a brown ponytail walking away in the rain. On one page, he drew himself as a small bird locked in a cage, while the sun, a figure clearly representing Clara, was forced away by a large dark shadow that looked unnervingly like his father. Dorian Sterling's world began to unravel. He had acted decisively convinced he was protecting his son from a manipulative grifter. He had expected Leo to be upset for a day or two, then adapt. He had expected to feel relief, a sense of having dodged a bullet. Instead, he was haunted. The house, once filled with Leo's hesitant but growing voice and laughter, was now as quiet as a tomb. The joy Clara had brought into their lives was gone, and its absence was a physical presence, a suffocating void. He would walk past Leo's room and see his son, sitting on the floor, staring blankly at a wall, the vibrant sketchbook lying closed beside him. Isabel tried to spin it. It's a transitional phase, Dorian, a temporary regression. He was too attached. This is healthier in the long run. But her words rang hollow. Dorian started to truly watch her for the first time. He saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes when she mentioned Clara's departure. He saw the way she bristled when a well-meaning maid mentioned how much happier Leo had seemed with that nice young woman. The seeds of doubt once planted against Clara began to sprout anew, but this time their roots were pointing toward Isabel. The breaking point came a month after Clara had left. Dorian entered his study late one night to find Leo sitting in his large leather chair. He had climbed up and was holding a framed photograph from the desk. It was the last picture taken of Amelia, his late wife. Dorian's heart stopped. Leo had never shown any interest in the photo before. Leo looked up at his father, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful accusation. He then pointed to the picture of his smiling mother. Then he pointed to his own chest. Finally, he pointed to the door, his small hand trembling. He repeated the gesture. Mama. Me. Door. It was a story in 3 parts. His mother had left through a door and never come back. Now Clara, the person who made his heart feel safe again, had been sent through a door, and she hadn't come back either. His meaning was devastatingly clear. You make the people I love go away. The silent accusation shattered what was left of Dorian's certainty. The conviction that he had done the right thing crumbled into dust, revealing the ugly truth beneath he had been manipulated. He had allowed Isabel's jealousy and paranoia to poison his mind. He hadn't protected his son. He had wounded him, perhaps irreparably. He had punished the one person who had shown them both genuine kindness, and in doing so he had become the monster from his son's drawings. Overcome by a tidal wave of guilt and shame, Dorian sank to his knees in front of his son. "Leo, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I made a terrible mistake." Leo just stared at him, his silent judgment unwavering. Dorian knew that apologies were not enough. He had to fix it. But he didn't even know where to begin. He had no idea where Clara was. For all his wealth and power, he had never felt more helpless in his entire life. The next morning, Dorian Sterling was a man on a mission, fueled by a self-loathing so intense it felt like a physical illness. He confronted Isabel in the sunroom, his voice low and dangerous. "What did you do?" he asked, his eyes boring into her. Isabel feigned confusion. "Dorian? Whatever do you mean? The private investigator, the social media post, her financial records. I want to see everything you showed me. Now!" A flicker of panic crossed Isabel's face. I threw it all away. It was upsetting. I didn't want to keep it in the house." "You're lying," Dorian stated, his voice like ice. "You never throw anything away." He took a step closer. "You hated her from the moment she walked in here. You saw her connecting with Leo in a way you never could, in a way even I couldn't. You couldn't stand it, so you destroyed it." Isabel's composure finally cracked. "I did it for you. For Amelia's memory. She was a nobody, a waitress trying to replace my sister, trying to worm her way into our lives. She was a kind girl who helped my son." Dorian roared, his control finally snapping. "She brought him back from a place none of us could reach. And you drove her away out of petty, pathetic jealousy. You used my grief against me. You hurt my son. Get out." "Dorian, you can't be serious." "Get out of my house, Isabel." He repeated, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Pack your bags. Be gone by noon." Isabel stared at him, her face pale with shock and fury, before turning on her heel and storming out. The first poison had been purged. Dorian's next task was far more daunting. He hired a real private investigator, not to dig up dirt, but simply to find Clara Maeve. It took less than a day. The report was simple. She was back living in her old apartment and working at the Daily Grind diner. The investigator also noted she had not cashed the severance check. The knowledge that she had rejected his insult money twisted the knife of guilt even deeper in his gut. For 2 days, Dorian wrestled with what to do. How could he possibly face her? What could he say that would even begin to atone for what he'd done? He rehearsed speeches in his mind, but they all sounded pathetic and hollow. In the end, he knew there was only one thing he could do. He walked into the Daily Grind at 4:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. The little bell above the door jingled the sound, making his stomach clench. The diner was quiet, and there she was. She was wiping down a table, her back to him. She wore the same simple uniform, her brown ponytail swaying slightly with her movements. She looked thinner, and there was a sadness in her posture that hadn't been there before. Martha, the manager, saw him first, and her eyes narrowed. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone protective. Clara turned at the sound of his voice. Her eyes widened, and a complex mix of emotions washed over her face. Shock pain, anger, and a flicker of something else. A deep, weary sorrow. She put the rag down, her hands trembling slightly. Dorian Sterling, the titan of industry, felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. He had Leo with him. The little boy was half hidden behind his father's leg, clutching the sketchbook to his chest. "Clara." Dorian began, his voice rough with shame. There are no words to tell you how sorry I am." Clara just stared at him, her silence more damning than any tirade. "I was wrong," he continued, forcing the words out. "I was a fool. I was manipulated by my own grief and by someone I trusted. I listened to lies because I was afraid. What I said to you, what I accused you of, it was monstrous, and it was unforgivable. I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness, because I don't deserve it. I'm here to beg you to consider forgiving me for Leo's sake." He stepped aside, revealing the small boy. Leo looked at Clara, his big blue eyes filled with tears. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. He opened his sketchbook to the last page he had drawn. It was a picture of Clara with a giant shining sun drawn over her head. He held it out to her. Then he took a deep, shuddering breath, and in a small, trembling voice that was nonetheless clear as a bell, he said a full sentence. "I miss you, Clara." That was it. The dam broke. The tears that welled in Clara's eyes were not of pain or anger, but of overwhelming love for this little boy. She rushed forward and knelt, wrapping him in a fierce hug. Leo dropped his book and buried his face in her shoulder, his small body shaking with sobs. "I missed you too, Leo," she whispered, stroking his hair, her own tears falling freely. "I missed you so much." Dorian watched them, his own eyes burning. This was the scene he had destroyed, this pure, beautiful connection. After a long moment, Clara looked up at him, her eyes red, but her gaze clear. "What you did," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "It almost broke me. You didn't just fire me. You made me doubt the best part of myself." "I know," Dorian said quietly, his head bowed in shame. "I am not coming back to your house. I can't," she said, the decision firm in her voice. Dorian's heart sank, but he nodded. He deserved that. "I understand." But then Clara looked down at the boy, still clinging to her. "But I will not abandon him again," she continued. "If you are serious about this, we can set up sessions. Here, or at a park. A neutral place. I will help him. Not for you and not for money, but for him. It was more than he could have hoped for. It was grace he hadn't earned. "Whatever you want," Dorian said, his voice thick with emotion. "And the offer still stands. Your tuition, all of it. Not as a salary, but as a grant, a gift, an apology. Please let me do that." "Much." Clara considered it for a long moment. It wasn't about the money, but about what it represented. It was his way of trying to repair the damage of acknowledging her worth. "Okay," she said softly. The road ahead would be long. Trust, once shattered, would need to be rebuilt piece by piece. But as Clara held Leo, who was now quietly telling her about the new squirrel he'd named Fuzzy, and saw Dorian Sterling standing there, stripped of his arrogance and filled with a humble, desperate hope, she knew this wasn't an ending. It was a new and far more honest beginning. Clara and Leo's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest currency we have is not money, but compassion. It shows us how quickly fear and suspicion can poison our minds, causing us to hurt the very people who are trying to help. Dorian, blinded by his grief, almost destroyed the one spark of light that entered his son's dark world. But in the end, a child's unwavering heart and a woman's incredible capacity for forgiveness showed him the way back. Their journey teaches us to look past our own prejudices, to question the whispers of cynics, and to cherish the simple, profound power of a kind word, a paper bird, and a second chance. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the strength of the human spirit, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and move you. Thank you for listening.